They take certain actions that they do, and I think in order to understand what Israel is doing and why they do certain things, such as the fence and the roadblocks, you have to understand what it's been like to live in Israel, what it was like to live in Israel from 2000 to 2005. You can't understand Israel without understanding the real sense of insecurity and vulnerability that everybody in the country feels. Right? You have a situation where you've got, if you compare Israel to a house, you've got suicide bombers trying to jump over the fence. You have drive-by shooters on the driveway. You have Qassam rockets coming through the windows in the south. You have Katyusha rockets coming on the roofs in the north, or potentially coming on the roof in the west. You have the Iranian president 4 kilometers from the border, threatening to blow up the entire house. Okay, that's the mindset the Israelis wake up to in the morning. And to understand what Israel's doing, you have to understand that mindset. And it's real. It's not a theoretical, right? Everyone knows somebody who was affected by terrorism. It sits in the back of your mind, and it impacts what the people think, and that impacts on the policy of the government. Israel's gone through an incredible transformation over the last 20 years. Right? In 1993, when the Oslo process started, the country embraced Oslo. The country embraced the process because they thought it would work. Right? If you look at the election results from 1992, right beforehand, right, the 2 major left-wing parties, or center left-wing parties in the country, Labor and Meretz, they won 56 Knesset seats out of 120. Right? In the last election, those same 2 parties won 16. Right? If elections were held today, according to poll, they would win 13. What happened? Did the Israelis stop believing in peace? Did the Israelis stop yearning for peace? No. What happened was simply the country was mugged by reality. Right? The country was bitten by reality. That's where we're coming from. And the tension that you see with America, I think to a certain degree, is because Americans are still coming from, or the administration is still coming from the position, like I said earlier, that if you just give up territory, you're going to get peace. Israel gave up territory. Israel withdrew from territory, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. And what it got in return wasn't peace, but it was Iranians. Right? It was Iranian influence. And that's the main problem we're facing.
Many Americans are under the impression that this is a territorial dispute that can be solved through the Arab-Israeli conflict. Do you believe that's so?
Look, I think that what we've seen over the last 10 years is that it's not a territorial dispute, right? If it were a territorial dispute, then we could have solved it. If it was just a matter of giving up territory and there are territorial disputes all over the world, right? And you can solve it by giving up territory. Israel tried that, right? I mean, Israel was willing to give up 97% of the territory, and it didn't do the job. So I think what we're seeing that this conflict its real character is emerging, that it's not necessarily a territorial dispute, but it's an ideological dispute, and that makes it much more difficult. Also, I think it's interesting if you talk about, is this a territorial dispute or not? When Yasser Arafat launched his war in 2000, right, the terror war against, what did he call it? Right, he could have called it a million different things. He could have called it the Ramallah Intifada or the Jenin Intifada. What did he call it? He called it the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Why Al-Aqsa? Because of the Temple, because of the Temple Mount, because of the mosque on the Temple Mount, because that said something to people. He knew what was going to fire up the masses, and that was what was going to fire up the masses. So I think, at least in Israel, I think we've been disabused by the notion that this is a territorial dispute. It's much deeper than that, which means it's going to be a lot more difficult to ultimately solve.
Do you feel that the U.S. creating a territorial solution is going to make a difference in the terrorism that the West is confronted by?
I think that if the U.S. pushes Israel to give in on territory, I think that they're gonna be facing the same type of thing also in the Middle East. I think what that does is that it just emboldens, it'll embolden the radicals, because they'll see that it works. Well, if it works in Israel, then it could work elsewhere as well, and I'm not sure that's in the West's best interests.
Where do you live in Israel, and how will that be involved in the final border negotiations?
I live in Ma'ale Adumim, which is a settlement just outside of Yerushalayim, just outside of Jerusalem, about 10 minutes outside of Jerusalem. A lot of people just take the settlements and dump them all in the same basket and say that they're all the same, they're all colored of the same paint. I think you have to distinguish in Israel between settlements. I think there are settlements which are very close to the Green Line, to the 67 border. Those are the settlements which are very much in the Israeli consensus. Most Israeli public opinion believes will remain, and in all the negotiations we've had over the last 17 years, those settlements will remain inside of Israel. There'll be land swaps or whatever. Ma'ale Adumim is one of those types of settlements. I mean, where I live, so that's that's our sense. Then there are other settlements which are much more religious, ideological settlements beyond the security fence. That's kind of a different kettle of fish.
And how confident are you that Ma'ale Adumim will be kept safe even under a Palestinian agreement?
You mean safe in that we're going to remain a part of Israel, or physically safe?
Physically safe from terror that the PA can't control.
That depends very much on the arrangements you have on the ground. I mean, if it's a demilitarized state that they get, then that's one thing. If it's a state where you're going to have missiles and submachine guns, then obviously that's a different story. I think one thing that you're seeing Netanyahu being very firm on right now is saying that, well, it's nice to have security agreements that are in paper, but if they're not implemented on the ground, right, they're not worth anything, which is why he's very much standing on the position that if there's a Palestinian state, there has to be an Israeli military presence on the eastern side of that state, right, so that arms can't be smuggled in from Jordan, right, because we've kind of been in this movie before. We left Gaza, we left the border between Gaza and Egypt, right. When we left, we saw what's smuggled in. We know what's going on in Lebanon, where there's international agreements that the UN Security Council 1701, that they can't smuggle in weapons from Syria into Lebanon. I mean, that's a joke, right? They've got 3 times as many missiles there as they did beforehand. So I think that any agreement you do have, you're going to see any agreement that Netanyahu signs, hopefully you'll have real security agreements on the ground, in which sense I won't have to worry, right? If there are not those security agreements on the ground, implemented on the ground, then obviously I'm going to have to worry, and a lot of other people are going to have to worry.
As a correspondent in Israel, do you get to go into Gaza? Do you get to go into the Palestinian areas?
No, I don't.
And would it be possible for Israelis to stay in settlement areas under a Palestinian autonomous sovereignty?
That's a very interesting question, because for some reason there's assumption that if there's a peace agreement, you have to uplift all the settlements and move everybody out to the last Jew. There are those who say, why? Why do you have to do this? If you're going to have a peace agreement, if there's really going to be peace, why can't there be a Jewish minority in a Palestinian state, much as if there's an Arab minority in a Jewish state? I heard somebody in the Prime Minister's office say a few months ago that the real test of whether they're willing to make peace with us and accept our existence is whether they're willing to let us live among them, right? If they're willing to let us live among them, then maybe they'll be willing to live next to us as well. So there are voices saying that there's no reason that in any agreement you have to go on the assumption that all Jews have to be removed. But then there's another question: will the Jews want to stay there? Okay, that's a different question altogether.
With many international media outlets closing their foreign bureaus, sources like AP, Reuters, and AFP become increasingly relied upon to deliver the story. Yet those outlets have a history of subjective reporting. What do you see out there in the press corps yourself?
Look, I think the major problem we have is that you only see what the camera gets, right? I mean, there's no wider lens here. There's no wider scope. So if there's a tank in Ramallah, right, then the camera gets the tank. It doesn't see the wider story, and there is a story about why the tank is in Ramallah. And I think that's the problem. There's no context. There's not enough context, right? You can't just look at an incident and report that incident in an isolated from anything around it. And all too often, I think that's what we see in the news reporting coming out of Israel.
Do you believe that the reporters there have an agenda that they're trying to justify the story of?
Look, I don't want to give any sweeping generalizations, right? I think there are obviously reporters there who have an agenda, but there are also reporters there who are fair, right? And are trying to do their job. So I won't make it as sweeping as that. Obviously, I think there's some problematic reports coming of Israel. I obviously think there's some reporters, not necessarily for the media outlets that you mentioned, but there are reporters who have an agenda. I think that's obvious, but not all of them do, right? Not all of them are trying to skew the report. But again, I think our problem, right, an Israeli problem, is we don't get context. There's not enough context, and without context, you can't understand the story, right? Like what I was talking about before, about you need to understand what the Israelis feel, their sense of insecurity and vulnerability, and understanding a lot of what you see, right? The security fence takes on a different glow. It looks differently if you understand where it's coming from. But if you don't understand where it's coming from, it looks dreadful, right? And unfortunately, in these 800-word wire reports, you're not going to get that in there.
There are several English language online news outlets, Haaretz, Ynet.com, and JPost.com come to mind. How is JPost unique? What are the unique characteristics of JPost, in your opinion, for viewers looking for the truth from Israel?
Look, I think the Jerusalem Post gives a very fair outlook of of the reality. I think we perhaps better than others represent where the country's coming from at this point in time. Right? I think one of the problems that you had in the administration in the beginning was that I'm not sure that they were getting a true picture of Israeli society. Right? I think Obama came into office with a rather skewed view of where Israel was at. I think he thought it was well left of where it really is. And I think if you read the Jerusalem Post, I think you're going to get a pretty good idea of where the mainstream Israeli society is coming from.
And how about the JPost as a source for international affairs?
Look, I can only talk about myself, and I mean, I look at the world and I look at the news through Jewish glasses, right? Because that's who I am, that's what I am. Okay, so when I write the news, that's where I'm coming from. So if I'm writing about American foreign policy, I'm obviously coming from where I am, and that's through a very Jewish Israeli perspective.
Is a Jewish perspective not necessarily a fair, objective perspective?
I'm not saying that. It's a fair, objective perspective, but it's a unique perspective, perhaps, right? I think that there's I think one of the beauties of America. I mean, Americans are fundamentally decent, good people, and they see the world through their own eyes, and they think they're decent, good people, so the world is a decent, good world. And I think that's wonderful. I think, however, you have to look reality in the face, and you have to realize that there are people out there who don't necessarily just want to have a good life for their family and their kids. They're interested in all kinds of things. They're interested in ideological things which Americans don't necessarily. It's not in their guts. It's not in their kishkas. And I think that's something that you have to, when you look at the world, not everybody's like you. There are people out there who are bad people, right? And it's incumbent upon us. It's incumbent upon us, I think, in the West, to be able to stand up to them and push back.
Push back how?
However it's necessary to keep it from moving forward, right? If it means fighting in Afghanistan, then it's fighting in Afghanistan. If it means whatever it takes, you have to defend yourself, you have to defend your values, you have to defend your way of life.